1.
Thank you for watching Bull City Rising's coverage of the 2015 City Council elections. And my name is Kevin Davis with Bull City Rising.
And I'm Lisa Sword.
We are here today with Charlie Reece, one of the 6 finalists for the council seats. Early voting begins on Thursday, October 22nd.
Tomorrow.
And the general election happening just in a couple of weeks. So this is a chance for us to get to cover a number of questions that Lisa and I have, and ones we've heard from the community as well with each of the candidates. So we'll have 5 of these posted up here this week. Without further ado, Charlie, do you want to tell us a little bit about yourself and what had you interested running for City Council?
Sure. My name is Charlie Reece. I'm running for Durham City Council. My wife and I lived in Durham for about 9 years. We bought our house just before we got married in 2007. So I guess that's closer to 8 years, 8 plus. We have a family business here in Durham. And so Durham was an obvious choice when we were looking to find a new place to live after we got married. We've just really loved this city and been embraced by the people and the culture. There's so many great things that Durham has to offer. And over the years, I've sort of become more involved in the political life of Durham. This spring, with Eugene Brown's retirement, thought a little bit about running for City Council, but I got to know a couple of the other candidates a little bit, and felt that there was going to be a good conversation, and kind of backed away. And then when Councilwoman Katati, to my mind, made a surprising announcement that she wasn't going to run for re-election, that kind of upset the political landscape in Durham. I think that's why so many candidates filed, that we had 2 open seats, and certainly the prospect of losing a liberal champion, a really progressive hero in Durham like Diane, caused me to rethink my own situation. My wife and I sat down and talked about it and prayed about it, and talked to my girls about it, and in the end we decided this was the right thing for our city and for our families. That's how I decided to run for City Council.
Kicking off with the questions, Charlie, as we go through the discussion here today. You've, as you say, been in Durham 8, 9 years. What are some of the decisions that you've seen City Council make over that period of time that you really disagree with or are concerned about? And are there any decisions that they've made that you find to be really strong, or the kinds of things that you would champion yourself as a council member?
Let's start with the disagreements. That way I can end on a positive note. I know there has been a lot of debate and conversation about the self-help credit union's proposal to build a development on the Jackson Street property right behind Durham Station. And I thought that that proposal deserved a little bit more consideration than the City Council appeared to be willing to give it at the work session last month. I think that there's a lot of promise behind the idea of letting the self-help credit union develop that kind of project right there. The mayor's concern about warehousing folks who are using affordable housing is well taken, but I do think that this is not the kind of project that the mayor specifically referenced. I believe Cabrini Green in his statements at the work session. I don't think that's what's envisioned here, and I think it does deserve some more consideration. I'm optimistic that some version of that proposal will be brought back up before the City Council not too long, and I do think that if we can work out some version of that proposal that the folks on the City Council that had concerns about it can live with, I do think that we'll be able to go forward in short order. But I was disappointed that that proposal wasn't given additional consideration because, the city and the county have made commitments about the number of, or the percentage of affordable units within a half-mile radius of each of the proposed light rail transit stops. And right now that percentage around the Durham station is 0%. And the proposal that self-help put together wouldn't get us all the way there. It wouldn't really get us a long way there, but it would have been a start. It would have created, I think, if not a mixed income development, certainly a mixed income neighborhood with the other residential units that are directly adjacent to that. So I think that's one decision, just the most recent one that I had concerns about, probably would have gone a different way if I'd been on the council. Probably the decision there's really 2 things that I'm most proud of recently. The first was the half penny for the parks. I was one of the proponents of the full penny, and I think if you take a look at what the Parks and Rec Department has done with that half penny in terms of working through their deferred maintenance backlog. It is extraordinary. The resurfacing they have done, the erosion maintenance that they've done, new fencing, new ballparks, new ball fields. I mean, the work that they have done with that little bit of money is truly astonishing. And I think a lot of the credit on that has to go not only to the people that work in the department, but also to Councilman Schul, who was one of the real champions along with Councilman Moffitt in terms of working with the Parks and Rec Department to see the need that was out there, to realize that current recurring funds weren't going to get the job done, and to create a special levy just for that purpose. And I think that's the kind of leadership I'd like to see more of in the City Council. The other decision, and it's not unbiased because I was involved directly in the work, was the work that the City Council did to encourage the city manager to adopt a number of the policy recommendations of the Fade Coalition last summer to combat racial profiling in the Durham Police Department and to really get at some of the root causes. I think there's a lot of work yet to be done on that. I think this year the mayor and the City Council worked with our courts to expand the diversionary program for misdemeanor marijuana charges. I think that's another good step in the right direction. But I think the way that the City Council was open to hearing from the community about that was really important. And I think also the way that the community came together to push those proposals, I think is a role model for how change can happen in our community. The Fade Coalition had worked really, really hard to put together not only concrete statistical evidence of the disparities in traffic searches, but also to put together members of the community who live in parts of our city that are disproportionately impacted by those disparities to come forward and tell their very human personal stories about their interactions with the police. And I think that combination was really powerful and made it really easy when the Fade Coalition came to a number of the more established community organizations like the Durham People's Alliance that I was privileged to work with, the Durham Committee, the NAACP, other organizations, and asked us, we're not looking for necessarily new policy proposals. We're not looking for you guys to now take the lead. What we'd like for you to do is turn up the volume on the community's desire for these recommendations. And so I think the great thing about that process was nobody was really worried about who got the credit, who took the blame, who got to talk first at a press conference. It was all about lifting up the voices that were in that community that were talking about the need for these recommendations. And so that's a long way of getting around that. That's the other thing that I'm most proud of.
But,
Go ahead.
great specific items. One agreement, two disagreements. One disagreement, two agreements.
Scratch that. Okay.
Let's drill back into the affordable housing a bit. And two quick follow-ups on this. We've talked a lot about the need for affordable housing downtown. The signature project after Eastway Village has been Rolling Hills and Southside. The ownership component in the Southside, the rental component with 100 affordable housing units just on the other side of the Durham Freeway from downtown. From that project, to what extent do you think that that's meeting some affordable housing needs, and what concerns do you have about how Rolling Hills has come along to fruition?
I think those units I think that project is a great success story in a lot of ways. It put affordable housing within reach of families that really need it in a part of the city that I think needed not only affordable housing, but also safe, healthy housing. And I think that's to be commended. I do have some concerns about the cost of that project and whether or not more projects exactly in that mold are really cost effective going forward. I think, frankly, those are some of the same concerns that people have about the self-help proposal. Because I think when we talk about the cost of that proposal, we have to talk about the value of the underlying land that would be conveyed to self-help for the purposes of developing it. But I think one concern that I've heard a lot of people talk about is the sort of upside down racial makeup of the folks that are in those units right now. And I think it's worth looking at that issue and finding out what is causing people of color not to be interested or to be brought into that program.
Which is the case for Southside, but I've never heard that for all.
No, I was talking specifically about
Southside. Okay, great.
So I think I don't really know what's behind that. We need to do a lot more work in kind of trying to understand the process. But that is one part of that does concern me.
Sure.
That and that sort of the cost-effective nature of those kind of developments going forward.
Sure. So again, back to the history of Rolling Hills and Southside. I think Southhelp has a lot of fans in the community, myself included. I think they've been a tremendous anchor downtown, and we wouldn't have downtown revitalization without Southhelp. That being said, NC Mutual's attempt for Rolling Hills in the 80s the Hester's attempt in the 90s. Both were, I believe, sort of this kind of coronation effect on selected developers. So part of what's happened with McCormick, Beer, and Salazar's involved in Rolling Hills is more of this RFP process, et cetera. So do you think that self-help, kind of getting this land or approaching this land outside that process is problematic from a precedent perspective?
Oh, there's no question that it is. And I think that's probably at the root of the concerns of many folks who advocated a slower approach. I think from my perspective, the free market isn't very good right now in Durham at developing affordable housing. The city council is going to have to take the lead, and one of the best resources we have is the city-owned property that we have to be able to leverage this kind of development.
Well, you were talking about policing earlier.
I was talking about that. Yes.
So before Chief Lopez resigned, you had made the specific statement that you felt he needed to be fired.
I did feel like we needed a police chief.
Okay. And so one of the hallmarks of the Bonfield administration has been a stronger firewall between the council and city hiring decisions. Does this reflect your philosophy as a potential council member? How do you feel about that relationship of who hires whom and protocol in that way?
First of all, that's a great question. I feel very strongly that the current form of government is the right one for Durham. I have a lot of confidence in the city manager and his ability to run his city, the city the way that he sees fit. And I don't believe that the city council, as city council, should take a role in hiring or firing anyone except the 3 members of the city council staff that they do directly fire and hire. Having said that, I believe that as a member of this community and as a candidate for city council, it is appropriate to talk, to answer a question if asked, do I believe we need a new police chief? And I was asked that question and I answered it. I think as a member of the city council, I think Steve Schuell's answer at that particular forum was probably the right answer, which what he said was, I have strong opinions, I've shared them with the city manager, and it's his job to decide what to do next. Since I am not a member of the city council, it was not when I answered it. I don't have that kind of a relationship with the city manager, although I've worked with him specifically on the policing issues. But I think if I can just briefly address some of the substantive issues around Chief Lopez. I was one of the folks who was convinced by many in the community in working on these issues last summer that firing Chief Lopez and hiring a new police chief was not the most productive use of our sort of community resources at that time. I was convinced, despite many of my deep concerns, that would be viewed as a Band-Aid solution and that it would take away from where our focus needed to be, which was on concrete policy reforms that we could identify, state succinctly, and impress upon the city council and the city manager the need for those reforms. And so that was our focus last summer. But I think since then, a number of other incidents have happened, a number of public comments on the part of Chief Lopez have been made. Let me rephrase that. Chief Lopez has made a number of comments and that caused me considerable concern about his ability to create or to rebuild a relationship of trust and confidence between the Durham Police Department and the people they protect and serve. And so I'm really glad that we're going to have the opportunity to hire a new police chief. And I'm especially glad to read comments that the city manager's made in recent weeks that he is open to hearing from the community about the types of qualities that we want to see in a police chief. I don't think the people of Durham or any community organization needs to be in the business of vetting resumes or interviewing candidates, but what I do think we all have to do is reach out to the city manager to talk about what we want to see in this person. Does the ideal candidate have experience with true community policing? What is her capacity for working in a very diverse city? What is his experience in police-community relations? I think if we lay down those types of markers and talk to the city manager about what we want to see there, and then the city manager goes out and hires someone that meets those criteria, then we're all invested in this person's success going forward. But that's not going to solve the problem of rising crime in Durham, but it's a great first start, and I'm glad we're going to have the opportunity to do that together as a community.
Great. Do you think it should be an open or a closed search?
What do you mean when you say that?
A national search, for example, or kind of looking among the ranks?
And also a public search where finalists are brought before the community, or the manager hires the best candidate, even if they're in office somewhere else and not willing to be publicly shopped around to new places.
I honestly don't. I'm happy to leave that to the city manager. I've been involved in both kinds of searches, and I don't think, obviously not for a police chief and not as a public official, but I think there are pluses and minuses to both of those, and I think, frankly, the city manager is going to need to make the best decision that he can about which process to follow. Again, I'm reluctant to have the people of Durham or the city council too involved in reviewing resumes of people and having that kind of process go forward. I think it's likely that our ideal candidate could very well be employed somewhere else and will have a need for confidentiality. So I want to give the city manager the flexibility to do that the way he sees fit. With respect to, do I see us hiring someone from another police department or someone from within Durham? I think there again, those two sets of qualifications are going to be somewhat different. I do think it's important to bring someone in who, if they don't understand the very special, the things that are very special about Durham, the different neighborhoods and what each one, the challenges each one faces, I think that's going to be a hurdle that anyone from outside of Durham is going to have to overcome. Having said that, I don't think it's an insurmountable obstacle. I would, if I were the city manager, I would tend to favor someone who's had strong management and public relations experience working and leading a police department of the size and diversity of Durham. That is a very tall order and a very narrow gap to fit through, but I think that's important. When you look at what the chief of police does in Durham, it's a large management challenge. We're always going to be resource constrained. We're about to go through the process of designing and building a new police department that in and of itself is a public relations problem for the city. And you're going to have to bring someone in who's going to have to hit the ground running right away in terms of rebuilding that relationship of trust. And that's a tall order. And so I'm not sure that someone from within Durham is going to have that kind of experience because of the way that our current system has pushed the chief of police forward as, in many ways, the chief spokesperson of the police department. And so that's why I think the management and public relations aspect is critically important. And we have to have someone who's got the experience doing that and doing it the right way.
Great. Shifting gears here a little bit, there's been so much talk, Charlie, in this race about neighborhood revitalization and investment in neighborhoods that haven't had the same success that downtown or some of the near downtown neighborhoods have had. At the same time, bringing investment into neighborhoods, making them more attractive places to live, can also accelerate the pace of change and what some call gentrification in neighborhoods. For you, what does neighborhood revitalization look like, and what does that mean?
Well, I think the first thing we have to understand is that our neighborhoods are one of the things that make Durham so great. We have historic neighborhoods that each of them have their own rich backgrounds, people in many places that have lived there for generations. And one of the most important things about talking about neighborhood revitalization is that we have to make sure that we're building on the strengths that currently exist in neighborhoods and not importing things that don't have any context or character within those neighborhoods. So, for example, the 23-story tower that's going in downtown that theoretically is supposed to break ground any day now, right? Assuming they got their financing together and are ready to go forward. That's not something that you could put really anywhere else in Durham except downtown. And so I don't think we ought to be casting about for incentives to develop that kind of large real estate development in a lot of other parts of the city. But what I do think we can do is focus on encouraging locally based entrepreneurs and finding, not necessarily bringing in businesses from outside of Durham into some of these neighborhoods, but focusing on building up the current infrastructure that exists in those neighborhoods now, and building support for entrepreneurs. There's a lot of great work that's being done right now downtown to do that, and I think we could look at creating the kinds of spaces, both physical spaces and also economic spaces, to do those kinds of things in other parts of the city. But I think from a housing perspective, I think what a lot of people are relying on is the light rail project to focus density around the rail stations and to concentrate the growth that we're going to have there as sort of a release valve to where you're seeing real estate prices increase in other parts of the city. I think that's sensible. I think that the planning department is moving forward with the ability from a zoning perspective and a UDO perspective to encourage that kind of walkable, dense development around the transit stops. But I think we can't put all our eggs in that basket, because I'm deeply concerned about the funding structure of the light rail project as it exists right now and whether or not we're going to be able to pull it off.
Sure.
And so I think the planning department is starting to realize, because this was a very abrupt U-turn that happened just about a month ago in the budgeting process. And so I think the planning department is starting to realize that we need more solutions. And I think that's another thing that our consultant, I hope, will be able to talk to us about, is how, aside from the concentrating effects of the half-mile zone around transit stops, what else can we do in neighborhoods to revitalize existing housing, to make sure that housing that is currently affordable remains affordable and is also safe and healthy. Because I think right now so much of our focus has been on those kind of zones around light rail, and I'm becoming less optimistic about the future for that project.
Sure. So as we're talking, Charlie, just over your shoulder, I see Cleveland Holloway,
Yep.
right? Mm-hmm. A neighborhood where, talk about grassroots, people who were making very moderate incomes, moved in, bought houses for $30,000 and $40,000. In some cases, owned by landlords who maybe did a good job, maybe didn't do a good job, maybe people living there on disability, SSDI, or almost nothing. And they did that sort of grassroots, entrepreneurial, uplifting. I think the first movers in there tried to be very protective of the community, tried to be very inclusive as best they could. Some would argue if that's even possible as an outsider. But obviously the pace of change that's increased. One of your colleagues running for council this morning expressed their understanding of a 400% increase in prices there. To your point about neighborhoods that haven't had the same success that downtown or some of the near downtown neighborhoods have had. At the same time, bringing investment into neighborhoods, making them more attractive places to live, can also accelerate the pace of change and what some would call gentrification in neighborhoods. For you, what does neighborhood revitalization look like, and what does that mean?
Well, I think the first thing we have to understand is that our neighborhoods are one of the things that make Durham so great. We have historic neighborhoods that each of them have their own rich backgrounds, people in many places that have lived there for generations. And one of the most important things about talking about neighborhood revitalization is that we have to make sure that we're building on the strengths that currently exist in neighborhoods and not importing things that don't have any context or character within those neighborhoods. So, for example, the 23-story tower that's going in downtown that theoretically is supposed to break ground any day now, right? Assuming they got their financing together and they're ready to go forward. That's not something that you could put really anywhere else in Durham except downtown. And so I don't think we ought to be casting about for incentives to develop that kind of large real estate development in a lot of other parts of the city. But what I do think we can do is focus on encouraging locally based entrepreneurs and not necessarily bringing in businesses from outside of Durham into some of these neighborhoods, but focusing on building up the current infrastructure that exists in those neighborhoods now and building support for entrepreneurs. There's a lot of great work that's being done right now downtown to do that, and I think we could look at creating the kinds of spaces, both physical spaces and also economic spaces, to do those kinds of things in other parts of the city. But I think from a housing perspective, I think what a lot of people are relying on is the light rail project to focus density around the rail stations and to concentrate the growth that we're going to have there as sort of a release valve to where you're seeing real estate prices increase in other parts of the city. I think that's sensible. I think that the planning department is moving forward with the ability from a zoning perspective and a UDO perspective to encourage that kind of walkable, dense development around the transit stops. But I think we can't put all our eggs in that basket, because I'm deeply concerned about the funding structure of the light rail project as it exists right now and whether or not we're going to be able to pull it off.
Sure.
And so I think the planning department is starting to realize, because this was a very abrupt U-turn that happened just about a month ago in the budgeting process. And so I think the planning department is starting to realize that we need more solutions. And I think that's another thing that our consultant, I hope, will be able to talk to us about, is how, aside from the concentrating effects of the half-mile zone around transit stops, what else can we do in neighborhoods to revitalize existing housing, to make sure that housing that is currently affordable remains affordable, but is also safe and healthy. Because I think right now so much of our focus has been on those kind of zones around light rail, and I'm becoming less optimistic about the future for that project.
Sure. So as we're talking, Charlie, just over your shoulder, I see Cleveland Holloway.
Yep.
Right. A neighborhood where you talk about grassroots. People who were making very moderate incomes moved in, bought houses for $30,000 and $40,000. In some cases, owned by landlords who maybe did a good job, maybe didn't do a good job. Maybe people living there on disability, SSDI, or almost nothing. And they did that sort of grassroots, entrepreneurial, uplifting. I think the first movers in there tried to be very protective of the community, tried to be very inclusive as best they could. Some would argue if that's even possible as an outsider. But obviously the pace of change in that's increased. One of your colleagues running for council this morning expressed their understanding of a 400% increase in prices there. To your point about what can we do absent light rail or not looking 15 years out, what are the policies today that make a difference in neighborhoods facing that change?
Well, I think it's important to remember that the city council can do some things and can't do other things. We're a policy-making body that has, in many ways, limited capacity to control a lot of the impacts of what people do call gentrification. But I think working with the Durham Land Trust to strengthen their ability to be impactful in neighborhoods outside their traditional service area is something I really want to look at. That's something that Jillian Johnson talked a lot about trying to strengthen that model. I don't know, I'm not 100% sure what else we can do to help them aside from give them more money, and I'm not sure whether or not that's a realistic option in the near term. But I do think that that model makes a huge difference in the parts of the city where they operate, and I would like to try to figure out some way to help them be more impactful in other spots. But when it comes to some of the other things we can do, I think that's one of the reasons why we need to keep looking, working with our consultant, but also keep looking at city-owned property in different parts of the city. I don't think affordable housing has to be a 4 or 5 story building that houses 80 to 100 units in every part of the city. I don't think that makes sense in a lot of spots. But there are ways we can use foreclosed properties, other types of city-owned properties, to try to develop affordable housing projects that are smaller, less impactful to the community, but can preserve the affordability. But it's a real problem. The other thing I think that people forget is that it's not just a dollars and cents pricing issue. That some of the reasons people leave the neighborhoods where they've lived in for generations are the sort of the social displacement and disaffection that happens. And I think there aren't a lot of policy levers that get at that. But I think as elected officials, as leaders in our community, we can talk to people who are moving into these neighborhoods and try to encourage them not to create new social networks, often online, by email, by social media, but through traditional methods, by going and knocking on doors and introducing yourself to your neighbors. Because often what new residents will find is that there's no need to create a new social network. There's one there already. It just doesn't necessarily conform to what younger folks perceive of when they move into a neighborhood. If it's not an email listserv, a lot of people think, oh, what are we doing? Right. But I think that kind of thing, including simple things that are as simple as including food at social gatherings that are meant for the entire neighborhood, broadly distributing information about these gatherings that aren't just through social media and electronic means, and going door to door and talking to your neighbors about those types of social events, but also how you can integrate yourself into the existing structure. I think being leaders and using the soapbox we have as elected officials is one way we can mitigate the often unavoidable consequences of new people moving into neighborhoods where they've not traditionally lived. Because I think it's that kind of social disaffection is a huge aspect to this. So I don't want to pretend that government is the answer to all of these problems. There are some things the city council can do, but where we lack effective policy levers in other areas, there are other things we can do, working with neighborhood organizations, working with nonprofits, to try to smooth some of those hard edges.
Great, thank you.
I wanted to follow up when you were talking about parks earlier in your opening statement. Inside the loop, there's very little public green space. We have CCB Plaza, but it's not green.
Tell me what you mean by inside the loop. I know what that means in Raleigh, but I'm not less certain of what.
Inside, you know, Ramsey to the south, Roxborough to the east, Morgan to the north, and Great Jones, the whole block that it is to the west. So central business.
So okay, central business downtown. Okay, okay, good. Okay.
And, you know, Chicken Bone Park is probably the only spot. So with more plans for intensive development downtown, and, you know, there's a lot of city-owned land down there, there is a risk that some of this public space could be privatized at some point. How does the city fully implement the downtown open space plan, particularly like pocket parks, and not just concrete plazas, in the midst of this kind of change? I know Bob Chapman has ideas for development downtown. There's a lot of talk about fixing the loop and what that would mean. So how do we keep some green space down there?
Yeah, no, that's really, really important, and it is a challenge. And one of my concerns about the fixing the loop proposal, the charrette that came out of the most recent one that came out of the consultants that are working on that, is that I wasn't 100% convinced that that there was sufficient attention paid to creating open space in that proposal. On the other hand, my other problem with the proposal is that the gold-plated version of it is extremely expensive, and I don't think necessarily within the reach of the city at this time. And I understand the rationale for some of the expenditures that are in there, and the need to activate, what a great word we've learned to use now, activate at street level rather than just reversing traffic flow or returning it to two-way travel. I do understand the need for some of that, but I also understand the need to try to sell this to people that live in other parts of the city that are not downtown. And so I'm cognizant of the trade-offs inherent in this process. But more broadly, there are no easy answers. We're going to have difficult choices. We do have city-owned property in certain parts of downtown. Many of us have said we need to make leveraging that property for affordable housing a priority in the next administration, and I think the folks that are elected are going to do that to varying and lesser degrees depending on who wins the election. But can we do that in a way that also builds in green space and open space for all Durham residents to use? I hope so, and I think we can, but it's going to take political will, it's going to take vision, and it's going to take being willing to take tough votes to do it. Because every piece of public land that we set aside for open space, for adding to an existing trail, for having the opportunity for people to have open spaces to recreate in, that's another piece of property that is not available to use for some of the other priorities we have. But I think the important thing as we go into it is to know that we need to have those kinds of spaces available for everyone to use. And when you talk about being concerned that some of the spaces are being privatized, I think I know the kind of concern you're talking about, but we should be clear that a number of the spaces that people have been concerned about in that respect were never public spaces to begin with. The American Tobacco campus was never a public space. And to the extent that there are concerns, and legitimate ones, about the fact that there isn't really a space like that aside from CCB Plaza, which is, as you said, a brick flat structure, let's keep in mind that the spaces that have been constructed are spaces that are generally open to the public, that are used for a lot of different things. But we do have to be careful because, especially from the free speech protesting type perspective, those spaces are not amenable to that use because they are privately owned. So that is a tension that I'm aware of, but I think we should be clear that a number of the spaces where people have expressed those concerns were never public spaces to begin with, and the fact that the private owners have made them available to the public is a great benefit to the city. But I do think there's something special about public space that we do need to make sure we create more of. Absolutely.
All right. Moving on to the next area of discussion. So Charlie, you've been active in the North Carolina Democratic Party, you've been treasurer since March, you've been on the state executive committee for 2.5 years. You know this is your first campaign, but there's a lot of political acumen, a lot of political instinct that people see in you. We've heard some folks wonder, is your plan to run for higher office at some point in time? Is Durham a stepping stone or a place that you expect to spend a full term in office? Any thoughts about how this ties into any longer plans you have, or is that at the edge of speculation?
Let me tell you, there was a time in my life, probably before I even moved to Durham, where I thought about running for public office. Then I had 2 young children in relatively quick succession, and those thoughts fled my mind for a long time. If I had any thoughts before running for city council about running for something else ever again, running for city council cured it. I can commit to you 100% right now. I will, if I am fortunate enough to be elected, I will not run for anything else except running for re-election for city council, if I'm fortunate enough to win, within the next 5 years. Just because, as you mentioned, I've been around politics and political candidates my whole adult life. My first experience in politics was knocking doors in the heat of a Massachusetts summer in 1989 for a Cambridge City Council race. And so I've been involved in a long time. People can try to tell you what it's like to run for public office, but until you sign the papers and put your name in the ballot, you don't know. Now I know. It's been, in many ways, the most rewarding thing I've done in public life, but there's no question that it's been the most difficult 3 months of my life for me personally, for my family, for our business. And the idea of what it takes to run, say, for the General Assembly now, you have to announce, in many cases, almost 2 years out, let alone run a statewide campaign. I mean, our Attorney General has essentially been running for governor for 3 years. I mean, there's no way I could do that. If I ever thought that I could, it was because I didn't understand what it takes to run for public office. I'm very happy that I chose the single most digestible nugget of campaign available in North Carolina. File in July. If you're lucky, you lose an October primary, you can be done. But if you're unfortunate enough to win and get through the primary, then you've got another month to go before you can ever get out of it. So that is a very long way of saying that I respect people tremendously that run for the General Assembly and run for statewide office. That's not in my future.
Okay.
It's 2:46, so we probably have time for one more question and then closing statements?
Maybe a couple. We'll try and move along quickly.
Excellent.
We'll skip past that question. You've been a board member of the PA as well, involved in the People's Alliance. People's Alliance endorsements appear to be extremely strong this year in terms of the strength of how well the slate did in the primary election. Yourself, Jillian Johnson, and Steve Schewel all coming in 1, 2, 3. At the same time, it's been a year where there's been some, a little more scrutiny, a little more interest in the PA's process, given there was a significant drive to increase membership in the PA before the endorsements, and a lot of new voices, which can be a very good thing on the one hand. It can also be a chance for sort of kind of elites to drive a process, even if they're very progressive and inclusive, desiring elites. Do you have any concerns about the role in general that PACs play, or how this year's endorsement process, whether it was PA or committee or Friends, played out?
Well, I can't really speak to the Friends or the committee endorsement process because I wasn't endorsed by them. I went through that process and I thought it was, as a first-time candidate, I learned a lot about how things work in Durham. But with respect to the PA process, and then I'll get to the PAC question more broadly, the PA process I thought was fantastic this year. It is sort of a time-honored tradition for the PA endorsement meeting that we bring new voices to the endorsement meeting. There is a time frame. Basically, you have until 30 days before the endorsement meeting to join PA and be eligible to vote at the endorsement meeting. And you have to pay your membership to the organization in order to be eligible. And that is a great way to make sure that the people who actually show up are invested in the future of PA. And that's one of the things I love about that process. And this year, like last year actually, we were PA. When I say we, I mean PA was the benefit of what I would call a new strain in politics in Durham that is very much more focused on grassroots activism. It is in many ways multiracial, much more progressive in terms of grassroots community activism and support. And this year, I think, in my mind, cements that the Durham People's Alliance is going to be the home for that new strain of politics in Durham. And I think that is fantastic for Durham, and it's fantastic for the People's Alliance, because what you're seeing is a new wave of not only people showing up at the endorsement meeting, but that translates into a new wave of support for the work of PA, both financially, but also in terms of grassroots door-knocking ability. The People's Alliance has been able to put into the field this year the kind of door-knocking operation that has traditionally been the province of political parties and some very popular political candidates. And so that's been very nice to see. I think more broadly to your question of are the PACs good for Durham, I think the PAC system is good for Durham as long as the organizations that make up that system, and right now it's been the three big ones, the Durham People's Alliance, the Durham Committee on the Affairs of Black People, and the Friends of Durham. I think the PAC system is good for Durham as long as all three groups are healthy, as long as each three is strong, as long as each three has committed membership that has bought into the values of that organization and is interested in translating those values into success at the ballot box and success in terms of public policy before the City Council and the County Commission. And I'm very optimistic that the Friends of Durham and the Durham Committee are on their way to becoming very strong players in that system. I think right now it's just a political reality that the People's Alliance is the stronger of the three, and that the candidates endorsed by the PA are reaping the rewards of that during this particular election cycle. But I think it's best for Durham if all three of these organizations are acting at peak efficiency, and I'm glad to see some of the new membership and new leadership, especially at the Durham Committee, is becoming more and more interested in the kind of grassroots organization it takes to be an effective political organization in Durham. So I think Durham is really special in that I don't know of any other city, aside from maybe Charlotte, and even there I don't think the PACs plays an important role as they do in Durham. But Durham is really special in that we create these avenues for people to find a political home for their own personal brand of activism. And when I first became politically active, PA seemed the natural home for me, and that's how I got involved with them, and then was fortunate enough to join their board. But I think that's one of the things that's great about Durham is that there's a political home for just about every view in Durham, but those organizations have to be strong and vibrant in order for Durham's political life to be strong.
Great. We'll reset on this. We'll edit out this brief section. And the one earlier on the GovJock.
Oh, leave that in, that's fine.
Be on the camera one. Well, that has meaning to probably two viewers.
2, 3, yeah.
Which would be yourself and myself.
That's
Okay, we're ready.
All right, very good. So we've gone through a lot of topics here. We're not really doing pure closing statements, but what didn't we ask you as questions? Like, what are things that you'd want viewers to know about your candidacy or about Durham and your perspective on it that we didn't get to here today?
You know, one of the things, last night we did a forum at the League of Women Voters and the AKA sorority, and they asked the single best question I've heard yet. And they said, okay, you're all candidates for city council, but you're also voters in Durham. If you had the chance to ask a member of the city council one question, what would it be, and then answer it? And I thought that was really, really neat. And so everybody actually, I thought, had really good answers. But my question would be, every candidate for city council is essentially talking about the same issues. How do we stay welcoming to working families and make Durham a place where working families can afford to live and work and raise their kids? How are we going to make sure that our economic growth is translated not into the enrichment of a few, but a prosperity that's broadly shared across Durham? And how are we going to keep our communities and our neighborhoods and our homes safe from violent crime and rebuild that relationship of trust with the police department? We're all talking about the same issues. what is it in your experience, candidate for city council, that lets me know you understand these issues from more than just a talking about them from a talking points perspective? What in your life prepares you to talk about these issues from a position of credibility? And my answer to that would be that, you know, my wife and I are very fortunate to live in Durham and to have a family business. We've been very, very lucky and worked really hard. But none of it came easily. My parents were teenagers when I was born. They didn't go to college. But they worked hard and graduated from high school. They worked 2 jobs to make ends meet. And so when we talk about housing that's not only affordable for working families, but also safe and healthy, I remember some of the apartments we lived in when we were first starting out. I remember the first house we lived in, the only house we could really afford in the northern part of our county. And so I know from personal experience what that's like and how important it is to make sure that the housing that working families can afford is not just affordable, but also safe and healthy for them. When we talk about economic development, I know how important it is for families to have not only jobs, but jobs that pay a living wage. That's why our business here in Durham was one of the inaugural members of the Durham Living Wage Project, because we do feel like that's important. And I think that's something, by the way, parenthetically, that the City Council can do a better job of, is lifting up projects like that and businesses that pay a living wage to other members of to other people in the community. Say, this is what it means to be a responsible member of our business community. We need to encourage other businesses to join the project. But, you know, because my family, my dad was flipping pizzas. I guess you don't flip pizzas. He was cooking pizzas when I was born, working part-time and going to high school. So, you know, I understand from a very personal perspective what that's like for a young family starting out. And, you know, like many people, we were the victims of violent crime because of the kinds of places we could live in. And so I know what it's like to need to be able to trust that when you pick up the phone and call the police, they're going to come to your house and treat you with respect and dignity, no matter what you look like, no matter how much money you're making, no matter where you live. And so that's what I would tell people, is that I think you give off all of us as candidates give off the impression that we know a lot about a lot and that we have well thought through the issues. But I think it's also important to understand sort of a little bit about each of our personal story and to know what drives us as a person to be involved in public service and where our vision for the city comes from. So that's kind of what I would talk about.
Okay,
Great.
great. Well, thank you.
Thanks
Thank
to
you.
Charlie Reece.
Appreciate it.
We'll have this posted up here very shortly, and look forward to everyone's comments.
Awesome. Can't wait to share it on Twitter.
Okay.
All right.
We're out.
Excellent.
Well done, Charlie.
Thanks, Kevin.
You did manage to work
Appreciate
your
it.
closing statement into your closing
Well,
statement.
you know, what can I tell you?
Statement.
What can I tell you? I'm developing.